Michael, just can you give us like 30 seconds on who you are and what you do?
Sure. I'm a software engineer. I ran my own company earlier in my career, worked for a number of startups in the Boston area, and then joined the other side in venture. Worked for a couple of venture funds, most notably Hustle Fund here in San Francisco, where I was the portfolio tech and product expert. So I would jump from company to company, problem solving, anything from small issues, server going down to larger team builds and just building out um, entire teams if that were necessary. And that was super fun. Just got exposed to a ton of problems, patterns of how to build products and how to not build products at this early stage. Loved doing that, and then started doing that on my own. So right now I work as a CTO, join companies typically between 12 and 18 months at a time and get them from point A to point B, either getting a good non-technical team up and running with the right setup or joining a technical team that's already in progress and helping troubleshoot or get to the next stage of
Got it.
scalability.
And Michael, we've had the benefit of getting to know each other better and better. Initially through a friend who actually we invested in his company, and he sold it. And then most recently, you've gotten to know a few of our portfolio companies and worked deeply with one of them. Maybe at a high level, because this is a thing that we think about a lot at our firm. We've seen some companies make shipping amazing, high quality product that serve more and more of the needs of their customers look almost effortless. And I know it's not effortless because there's all sorts of physics going on behind the scenes. And then we've observed some companies where it's kind of like the exact opposite. I don't know if there's a simple answer for why some make it look easy and others struggle. I'm curious, like any general observations about why some companies are, particularly at the early stage, where like you got lean teams, and in some of these cases you had like strong technical co-founders, and in some cases you maybe didn't. But I'm just curious, like as you've done your work, any general observations about why some companies make this look easy and some do not?
It's an excellent question. I think there's three buckets that, if we have to generalize, most of these cases fall into. Nuance aside, on each company is a little different, but one of the most common things I see is founders not talking to the customer enough. And that's often talked about from the GTM side of things, but from kind of the CTO perspective, it's always underappreciated just how much a founder needs to drive what needs to get built. Very commonly, a founder will bring on a technical, like a CTO or VP of product or whatever, and they expect that person to just tell the team what to build, and that never works. Very early, the founder is the PM of the company. They have to drive the vision. The only way to do that is to talk to the customer a lot and then make really good trade-offs that they understand intrinsically for what needs to get built. And there's a result of that, what needs to not get built. So I call that proactive deprioritization. Most companies don't do that. It's like because the reality is, if you have one engineer, you have 100 engineers, or you have unlimited AI credits or whatever, your bandwidth is still going to be limited. And so for every single thing that you accomplish, you also have to agree that something else does not get accomplished just yet. So I think that discipline has to be there and is there in successful companies. Another thing I see very commonly is that in recruiting strategy, people try to go after a really shiny, big company, or maybe even like a senior technical executive from a startup that recently got acquired. And the reality is, that person probably comes from an environment where they had way more support around them in terms of QA infrastructure, all sorts of engineering teams. And they're not necessarily in the mindset of doing what you want them to do, which is to be very early, very executional, hands-on, working on whatever is required for 12 hours a day at time. And so companies will often do much better just looking at who can get the job done now, whether it's contractors, whether it's there's friends, whatever it is. And then as you build more, then you can attract better engineering talent because you've proven more of your ability to execute. So I think that's another big bucket of where things kind of tend to go sideways early. Third reason I see companies flounder quite a bit is a lack of clarity. There's this concept that we talk about a lot of ownership and hiring people that take ownership. And I think all of that is good. But very early, if the first step we discussed, if the founder really knows what needs to get built, then I think kind of as a litmus test, all of your engineers, at least in the beginning, should wake up in the morning and know what to do. That means that you have to have a really good pipeline from product to engineering. You write high quality tickets, things are well documented, things are well prioritized, things are listed, everything's asynchronously visible. If you get that done, like if all of those three are in place, pretty much it's hard to mess things up.
You mentioned active deprioritization, kind of like don't hire for the resume, and lack of clarity. When you drop into a company, how do you diagnose which of those things are the problem, and which is, maybe they're all happening, but like which is the most important problem to tackle first, assuming it's one of those three challenges that the company's dealing with?
It's always a matter for me of talking to the engineers first and talking to the people on the ground first. So the one of the last company that you and I collaborated on, it became very clear just asking everybody on the engineering team what their day is like, that everybody was overwhelmed. And the reason they were overwhelmed is because there was no prioritization set for them, right? So everything was urgent. And there's a fine line there because you do have to maintain a sense of urgency and you have to ship. And, we all understand that like startups take a lot of work. But if you just talk to anyone on your team and you ask them, hey, what's your plan for today? What's your plan for the week? If they cannot tell you, provided you hired good people, which usually you have, if they cannot cogently tell you that answer, then you kind of know there's a problem. And then based on how they give you the answer, you can start digging into, like, is it overwhelmed, too much pressure on certain things that don't need to get done? Is there a lack of specs, lack of requirements?
So is that the best way to kind of diagnose if active deprioritization is happening or not? Like, what about the others? Like, how do I diagnose if they may be hired for the resume or they just lack clarity?
Typically, people are able to communicate with a ton of specifics. If they are like the more they are involved in a healthy, high functioning organization, the more specifics they can give you about what their role is, how they rely on others, what they hope to accomplish. And typically, when you see people that maybe have been, let's call it, overhired or overqualified for the job, they will use much more vague expressions like, we're trying to, like, people will say, we're trying to establish a more scalable organization or something like that, is a very different answer than we're trying to reduce the number of tickets per engineer per week because we've observed that our optimal velocity is managed at 20%, less volume. The more you can kind of get people into those specifics, the more
is that diagnosing right whether or not there's clarity?
It's a little bit of both, because with clarity, it's like, I think clarity comes from specificity. That's typically the pattern, because the moment you lose specificity, you stop seeing things clearly. And then you also have to look at the top, right? Because that's where a founder or product leader should always be able to tell you what is the price of what they're currently accomplishing. If they don't know the price, that's always a red flag, because somebody's paying that price. Like, your engineers are paying that price, your customers are paying the price. If you don't know what the price is of doing something faster, prioritizing a feature that somebody just asked for, then they're not fully in the context. They lack specificity.
And on the last one around kind of, and this resonate, all of these resonate, including like we hired the resume. I can think of a very specific company where we brought in what looked like a rock star. And this person had been years removed from operating with limited infrastructure, where you had to be a player coach, IC, with maybe the potential to go into a management role and like just wasn't ready to go back to the ground floor. How do you diagnose whether or not that's going on at the organization?
Diagnosing in the sense of like, there's somebody who's been overhired and they're not
Yeah.
being productive.
Or is that just you walk in and you just see it immediately?
I tend to observe it by talking to the people that they report to and by talking to the people who report to them. And almost always you will find in those types of folks, there's an inconsistency, right? The people who they report to will oftentimes kind of like be managed, and they will say like, well, these are our targets. This is what, this is where we're trying to get to. And then the people under them will actually lack a lot of clarity. And that's kind of disconnect is something to watch for as a red flag. I think another red flag, and this manifests, there's quite a number of different flavors that this can take on. Another manifestation is actually failing to communicate clearly upwards, right? So if you ask a founder, what are the goals that a particular executive or leader or engineering leader expects to deliver for them by the end of the month, the quarter, those should always be clear. And typically really skilled, the people that have been hired well, the people that are appropriate for their context, they will always know their targets longer range. And the higher level the person, the more context they can maintain on targets that they're hoping to hit.
So someone of your experience, skill, and bedside manner drops into my company, and I'm probably initially suspicious, distrustful. We have, two venture partners that work with our companies, and I often talk to them about like, how do you gain trust? Like when you drop into a business, how do you think about not just diagnosing, coming up with probably a great plan, but actually executing it and really like earning trust to be able to do more and more with the company? What's your approach to that?
I work with venture-backed companies a lot, including, in our relationship, you're obviously an investor, and I think people tend to be a little guarded whenever somebody is kind of invited into the company from above. And so I try to never come in as the expert, like as the guy with experience or anything like that. In fact, for the first 2 weeks, I just try to not talk at all. So I'll join some meetings, but I'll ask questions, as many questions as I can that are technical in nature. But I just want to follow the engineers around, listen to their concerns, listen to how their day is going, talk to the founders, talk to the business side of things, and just build an understanding. And then once that's done, if you can articulate back to each one of these folks, what they are feeling, what you have understood they're feeling, that's step one to gaining trust. Because when I'm involved, oftentimes these companies are dealing with some sort of trouble or lack of velocity, or something's gone, some challenges with the team. It's never good to add pressure because plenty of pressure is already there. The number one thing that I want to do is just make everybody feel heard and establish that we're going to work on a solution together, and be a part of the team. That's always, and ideally just do that every day forever. Then you can actually start forming some solutions and get buy-in for people. That's kind of the initial phase. The second phase is I typically, in a lot of situations where something bad or even just any sort of adversity has hit the team, oftentimes there's a lack of, it kind of hits their confidence and it hits their cohesiveness and how they move forward. And so my very first steps are usually not to say, oh, who's to blame for this? It's how do we reestablish that momentum that these companies usually have had in the past? So how do we scale down our goals, even if it's for a few weeks or a few days, and just prove to the team that things can get done? And then you go ticket by ticket, you execute, you kind of celebrate those wins, and then you figure out how to build on that. And trying to stay positive rather than negative usually gets people banded together on each other's side, on my side, and things can work out.
So, and I love this. I'm taking tons of notes here. Every once in a while, though, I'm guessing after 2 weeks and listening and articulating back to everybody, hopefully what they're feeling, and everybody's heads are nodding. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Like you're spot on. And now we help you kind of like get back onto a good trajectory, momentum. Like I'm guessing there are though times where you have to deliver a very hard message or make really hard decisions or introduce medicine that tastes really bad. What about that moment?
That's tough. The best way to deal with it is as soon as possible and as direct as possible. So I try to avoid any sort of corporate speak, any sort of wandering around the topic. Everybody in these situations, in my experience, basically knows what's going on. Everybody already knows, even before I'm involved, or once it's clear, like maybe there's a person who just hasn't been, who is maybe a good person but doesn't have the right skill set, and they've been hired incorrectly for the job. Then you let them know, and even using that terminology, saying, "Hey, that we've decided to build the team differently. We're gonna have to let you go because we're gonna rethink how this role is gonna operate." And I wanted to let you know first, and we'll support you in whatever your next steps are going to be. Just saying that very directly and not beating around the bush is helpful. Oftentimes, a founder will develop emotional relationships with their early employees or contractors. And these can be particularly hard because, sometimes these relationships are just very positive and you don't want to let someone go who's been there for you early. Sometimes these relationships can actually be quite contentious, but it's almost like this tension is almost keeping the relationship in place. I've found that the best way to deal with those is to frame it in terms of the rest of the team, right? Because you do have to think about that person's well-being, and that's the right thing to do. You also have an obligation to the rest of the team to maintain their jobs and to do the best by them and to maximize their potentially shareholder value. So you have to think about how do you set all of them up to win. And I think that is a framing that I find to be the most amicable to everyone. I almost never would, or at least personally, I avoid any kind of like expert-based approaches. Like in the past, this has worked, and therefore impose this on you. That is, even if that's the case, I think it's the worst way to present things. It always should be about the
Interesting.
people
Yeah,
involved.
Ram on our team often talks about playbooks versus fundamentals. And
Yes.
yeah, everybody would love a silver bullet playbook that just works, rinse and repeat. And like it's never the case because each one of these arrives in all different shapes and sizes and with strengths and weaknesses. And there are, in his view, fundamentals that should be applied. But like the idea that you can just apply the same playbook to every company is dreaming. If so, we'd all be doing it.
I was talking to a friend about this the other day, who runs a pretty successful company. He told me that he loves the Tolstoy quote, which is that every happy family is the same, and every unhappy family is unhappy in their own way. I think that applies to startups surprisingly well. It's like a lot of the really successful companies have these common things that you can kind of point out, but each one that is not there is kind of strays in from that
I
in
love
its own
that.
direction.
My last question, and so like you've been involved, let's say, with a company now for a period of time, things all of a sudden start to go much better. How could you ever want to get rid of you? How do you know when is the time to like move on? Because I know how you like to run your business. Like when do you know like, hey, I actually think things are in a good place and it's time for me to go?
The best outcome is if you had a goal set at the beginning, and I think that should be the case with every single relationship, every single employee, contractor. I think when you open a relationship, just like the company, you should kind of have an exit plan, right? Maybe that exit plan is I'm going to join the founder on day zero and I'm going to leave when we're sold for $100 million. Totally fair. But you should have that in mind. And things change, obviously, on the ground all the time, but having that plan helps. So, with me in particular, it's always where's the company right now and what is point B to which we need to get that company. That might be a funding round. That might be a place where you reach product market fit, and then the next milestone is scalability. And so then we might bring a CTO who's an expert in scalability in your particular industry. So it all depends on the circumstances. But again, to me, it's all about going back to clarity, right? Like what is the purpose of the engagement and what do you need to do to fulfill it.
So we talked about the general problems, how to diagnose them, how to build trust, and kind of work with the team to get to where you want them to get to or where they want to be. And then when it's time to leave. This has been awesome. Like a lot of wisdom in here. Any other kind of parting thoughts on this topic of dropping in to help companies become the best version of themselves on the product engineering side?
Another thought popped up on the very first question you asked me. It's just like, what are some common success patterns and what are sort of anti patterns? Another big one that I don't think we discussed is the distinction between a product management role, just a lead engineering role, and the CTO role early. I find that most founders, especially non-technical ones, don't quite gain sufficient clarity and understanding of how that should be set up. And some things I see going wrong is like they'll hire a CTO or like a very senior engineer, but then they basically expect that engineer to be the product person. That almost never works well. And they expect that engineer to be accountable for maybe even the design or like figuring out, what to build based on customer input. Certain people certainly have both skill sets, but that's not the default. Likewise, they will sometimes have a product manager who comes from a non-technical background. They can be a perfectly capable product manager, but they might not be the right person to manage a team of 3 engineers in your industry. So having that definition is extremely important early. For example, a good applicable case of this, if you're building, let's say you're building like a foundational LLM, something super technical, absolutely, like a long-range, full-time CTO should be your absolute first hire. However, if you're building like an e-commerce site, maybe you can go with a dev shop that builds e-commerce sites twice a day, and they can just print one out for you. You test them with it. You build your own eventually. Or you're doing like vertical SaaS, right? That's where you just need, there's no particularly rocket science code. You just need a couple of good developers and like a fractional part-time engineering lead to, keep the wheels turning smoothly. So picking your model and the right team for that model is really important early.
I know I could ask you a lot more questions, but I want to keep this to 30 minutes. This has been awesome, Michael. Really appreciate you carving out some time to discuss this.
Great chatting with you,
Awesome.
William.
We'll be in touch soon, I'm sure.